Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 9th of July of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. But before we start, we'd like to talk with you a little bit, just a few minutes, about the entire situation on the front lines and the entire situation among the Russian soldiers, among the Russian military authorities and the Russian commanders. You know that since the beginning of June we saw the endless attempts from the Ukrainian side to attack the Russians in Petykhatki, on the Bradley Square, and Vremivka tactical bridgehead. We saw the endless numbers of video or endless number of pictures, different types of reports from the combat lines, where the Russian soldiers were saying that almost every single Ukrainian attack were repelled and the Ukrainians were completely defeated. Imagine yourself, we saw a lot of videos and everybody of us have our own opinion about the situation on the combat line. Somebody supports Ukraine, somebody supports Russia, but obviously we see that Ukrainians haven't managed to achieve the results that they wanted to achieve and the results that the Western countries wanted to see. We understand this. You and me, we understand this, and we are not on the combat line. But imagine yourself the situation with the Russian officers, Russian soldiers, Russian generals who see these endless waves of Ukrainian attacks, those mid-storms, and that the Ukrainians are completely defeated. Imagine yourself what is going on in their minds. And I'm not sure about there are I believe a lot of questions, a lot of things, a lot of ideas, but I understand that everybody from the Russian side have one important thought, one important idea in their minds, and the idea is about, so if the Ukrainians are so unsuccessful during those counteroffensive operations, maybe it's time to start. Maybe it's time to counterattack. Maybe if they're so unexperienced and we're so unsuccessful, maybe we are able to get better results. And as I understand and as I see, according to the latest reports that we received from the combat lines, the Russians started counter-offensive operations, and they have already started, and there are very fierce fightings in the vicinity of Avdiivka. Today we will discuss this operation. The Russians started counter-offensive operation on the Bradley Square. The Russians have launched a very significant attack on Liman front line, and the Russians started checking and trying to understand the Ukrainians' defense belts in the vicinity of Kupiansk. And basically right now, these days, there are no more Ukrainian counter-offensive operation. Currently, we are the witnesses of the beginning of the Russian greatest counter-offensive operation. And as I see, the Russians shows completely better results in comparison with the Ukrainians. Now let's start from the beginning and let's start from the situation on the ground. And the first area we're going to talk about is Petykhatki, Zherebyanki and Lapkova. As we discussed, the Ukrainians were forced to move their forces of 128th Mountain Assault Brigade back. This brigade was completely defeated, completely collapsed. The level of losses, we don't know the numbers, of course, but as I understand, the level of loss of this brigade is higher than 50% of just killed soldiers, and I'm not talking about the wounded, about their spirit, about their situation with their minds and with their heads. Of course, obviously the situation is critical as well. The Ukrainians were forced to move this brigade back. I would like to remind you that this is a very famous brigade, and if you remember, during the Battle of Kherson, this brigade also was one of the first brigade that started offensive operation in the vicinity of Davidov Brod, on all those settlements in the vicinity of Snegirivka and so on, and they also had a lot of losses. So 128th Brigade is one of the unluckiest brigade in the Ukrainian forces. I believe that the most crazy or the worst soldiers, or let's say maybe the prisoners, are sent to this brigade as some kind of act of punishment or something like this. To get inside of this brigade is already a big punishment for your entire life. And the Ukrainians, we discussed that to replace this brigade, the Ukrainians were forced to move the forces of 117th Mechanized Brigade and 116th Mechanized Brigade, and I expected that exactly these two brigades will restart offensive operation, will continue attacks. But today the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported, and the soldiers on the ground and the officers on the ground and bloggers and reporters reported that Ukrainians, at least for today, were using the forces of 15th Operational Brigade Karadak of National Guard. These forces were attacking the Russians. Of course, all those attacks were repelled, the Ukrainians were defeated. And today we got another video. We discussed this in the previous video, and today we got more details. In particular, in this video we see at least two tanks, one Tu-70 T-72EA and PT-91 Twardiow of Polish production, and of course personal armored carrier M113. The Ukrainians were defeated and were forced to step back towards their previous positions. Now we are moving to the Bradley Square. Today we got also a lot of videos from this territory. As was discussed in the previous videos, the Ukrainians launched and the Russians confirmed that that was pretty effective offensive operation from the Ukrainian side. Probably during the Russian rotation process or after another artillery preparation, the Ukrainians made a very fast rush to the south and they managed to capture a lot of Russian positions. They managed to capture some trenches and so on. And the Ukrainian forces got very close to this Rabotinas, the settlement itself. They called for help, and the Ukrainians launched sent armored vehicles for some kind of support. But after that, the rain started. The rain had started. The weather became very bad. The quality of the ground became very poor, and the armored vehicles basically stuck somewhere in the north. And the Ukrainian soldiers that were in front of Rabotina were cut off from their mainland because of weather, and they stuck. They stuck. The Russians after that moved their armored vehicles to the combat line, to the edge, and the Russians start bombing and shelling the Ukrainians from all sides using all types of weapons they have, and basically they just I don't know, like reduce these positions, the ex-Russian positions, to ruins. We discussed this military adaptation. For example, in particular on this front line, the Russians still use the tactic of artillery bombing of the own Russian positions, and after that artillery attack, the Russians returned back. They recaptured their positions, and basically we got the video from the Russian side how they were checking the trenches. As you can see, the Russians feel themselves pretty comfortable. We are not going to watch the entire video. I will just describe you that dozens of Ukrainian soldiers were buried in those trenches under Russian artillery fire, and basically this entire Ukrainian platoon was destroyed, or maybe squad. So there are no longer Ukrainians on this forest line, and the Russians easily returned and recaptured the lost positions during the battle of the previous 24 hours. Now we are moving further. We are going to talk about Vremivka tactical bridgehead. There were no changes during the previous days. The Russians repelled again the Ukrainian attacks. The Russians are not doing any attempts to counterattack. The Ukrainians were suppressed, they were pinned down on their positions, and currently from the Ukrainian side they try to discover and try to suppress Russian artillery. And for example, today the Ukrainians published a very interesting video how using the system HIMARS they destroyed the Russian let's say radar Zoopark. This is a very modern Russian radar that can discover and find any type of artillery systems for a very long range. And as you can see, this Russian radar Zoopark was located very far from the combat line, and the Ukrainians managed to discover this radar and destroy this radar using HIMARS. But for now, there were no more attempts from the Ukrainian side to launch massive attack. Probably there were attempts to send some commandos and squad, but all of those attempts were repelled by the Russians. There are very heavy clashes in Ugledar, and today there was some videos. Most of them were not geolocated. For example, the Russians from their side published the videos how they captured some residential areas. Most of the videos we received from residential areas, so probably the Russians attacks from the settlement, from the, let's say, Nikolskoye and from Nikolskoye and from this area, from Pavlovka to the north, trying to capture the Ukrainians' residential and let's say farms. And they published some videos that weren't geolocated, so we haven't added them. And the same situation, the same story we saw from the Ukrainian side. Maybe they were counterattacking, and also the Ukrainians also published some videos from residential areas saying that this is the video how we managed to recapture this or that lost positions or something like this. So for now, we just know that there are very heavy clashes, but without any provements of video or photo confirmations of results of those attacks. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the entire losses of the Ukrainians from Petykhatki to Ugledar were around 210 soldiers. As you can see, the level of losses is very heavy. For example, yesterday the level of losses was around 170 soldiers. The day before yesterday 200 soldiers, and let's say on the 6th of July the level of losses was 165, and on the 5th of July, so like 4 days ago, the level of loss was 300 soldiers. So as you can see, after 3 days of small pause or some kind of reduced of actions, we see the restart of Russian offensive, or maybe the restart of Ukrainian offensive operation, and exactly at this moment we see the increase of level of losses from the Ukrainian side. So 210 soldiers and 11 armored vehicles, including 4 tanks, and furthermore the Ukrainians also lost a lot of artillery systems, including at least one M109 Paladin howitzer, self-propelled howitzer of the Western countries. And now we're moving to the most important bridgehead, to Donetsk area. There are very fierce fighting, very heavy clashes, and this is exactly the area where the Russians continued their counter-offensive operation, and this is exactly the area where the Russians took a decision to check the Ukrainians' defense belt. They're trying to check the entire situation, and not just to check today and these days. The Russians launched a massive attack using not just like platoons, there was a real squads, probably tactical platoon squads or something like this, and mechanized squads, my bad. And the most fierce fightings took place in the vicinity on the eastern flank of Avdiivka. For example, the Russians today published the video how they were bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions using the flamethrower systems. It was some kind of artillery preparation. The Russians were trying to bomb and destroy the Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian infantry among the forest lines. If you remember, during the previous days we discussed a lot of videos from the Ukrainian side how they were regrouping infantry, tanks, and how the Ukrainians were maintaining the gray zone in this area. If you remember, just during the previous days the Ukrainians took a decision to maintain the gray zone, and first of all they captured this forest line. Also the Ukrainians moved to this flank, and they also captured these forests, these belts, defense belt. There was a lot of videos how the Ukrainians were moving in this area. So basically the previous days, as I understand, the Ukrainian intelligence worked fine and they discovered the Russian plans, or basically they managed to discover the accumulation of Russian armored vehicles somewhere in the vicinity of Novosilovka Drugaya. They discussed, analyzed everything, and took a decision to maintain and to move their infantry as close as possible to the settlements like Krasnogorovka and Veselaya. And as a result of that maintaining, the Ukrainians developed the bridgehead and got very close to these positions. The Russians, of course, they also understand this is like currently this is a normal tactic, this is normal military adaptation. Everybody understand the next step of the enemy, and the Russians launched that artillery preparation. They bombed significantly the Ukrainian positions using flamethrower systems, and after that artillery preparation, the Russians launched massive attack using significant number of armored vehicles, tanks, personal armored carriers. Let's just take a look at this video one more time. Just on this episode we see at least 3 tanks and at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 personal armored carriers. Imagine yourself the number of forces, particularly just on this video. And this video is geolocated, and this video confirms the Russian attempts to attack. Let's take a look at this video closer. On this video we see another tank, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 personal armored carriers, completely fully loaded with Russian infantry and Russian stormtroopers. The Russians made a lot of attempts to attack, and that was a very big attack. And the most important is that we haven't seen, and this is like a real fact, maybe we are going to see this tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, but let's say that by the 9 p.m. of 9th of July of 2023, we haven't received from the Ukrainian side any video confirmation of destroyed Russian convoys, as the parties like to show during every attempt of enemy to attack. They usually in an hour, and basically in a few hours they start publishing the videos of destroyed convoys, of destroyed vehicles on the mines. So basically this is the first evidence that say us that Russians probably were very successful during that attack, and probably the Russians managed to push the Ukrainians back. And currently this is maybe it's not the real beginning of storming of Avdiivka from the east, but at least this is the first step before that greatest battle, the Battle of Avdiivka, that I believe is going to start very soon. So this video was geolocated, and basically the Russians were attacking in this direction. So to the south, trying to cut the supply roads of Ukrainians that goes from the central part of Avdiivka to the north. I believe that soon we are going to receive more updates about the results of that attack. This attack, if you ask me, in my opinion, I didn't expect this attack because the Russians mainly were attacking in this direction. They were trying to capture these trenches, the trenches between the settlements Kamyanka and Krutaya Balka, this area. But maybe that was some kind of artillery preparation, and that was attempts. The Russians also were using flamethrower system TOS. Maybe the Russians were trying to secure the flanks and to reduce the Ukrainians as much as possible on this bridgehead, and by those attacks they secured the flank, and after that they launched significant attack in this direction. We need to wait more, and if the Russians were or are successful, sooner or later we're going to receive more updates from the front line, and the map will be updated. Anyway, this map is going to be updated because, as I understand, this area, this one I will tell you, I will show you on the map, on the screen. This map, this area either in the gray zone or at least under Russian control. So for now, at least in the gray zone. So we will update to adjust the Ukrainian positions, and we will move the Ukrainians closer to Avdiivka, and we will not color this territory in Russian color, but it shouldn't be under Ukrainian color as well. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of fierce fightings on Donetsk and Artyomovsk front line, the Ukrainians lost 180 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles, and 3 artillery systems. And the thing is that, for example, Ukrainians lost the RM-70 Vampire, and Ukrainians lost Palladian M109 and Msta-B self-propelled howitzer. Furthermore, the Russians published another video, another piece of information that wasn't included in the Ministry of Defense report, and they're showing it was like just an update with just a picture without video confirmation, but the Russian intelligence reported, sources from intelligence reported that as a result of artillery attack, the Russians destroyed the warehouse in the small settlement by the name of Mikhailovka, this one, that located on the, let's say, on the west of Avdiivka, on the west of Donetsk. And as a result of that attack, the Ukrainians lost 2 HIMARS systems, 2 machines that reload those HIMARS systems, and 2 trucks with munition. They destroyed one M777 howitzer, and around 50 soldiers were killed, and the number of wounded is unknown. We need to wait, of course, more. I believe that if this piece of information is correct, we're going to receive some report from the Ministry of Defense, or at least some video confirmation. But this is the fact that I just think we need to discuss that event that took place during the previous 24 hours on Donetsk front line. When talking about Artyomovsk, there are very fierce fightings, but as we can see, after failed attempt from the Ukrainian side to capture Klishchiivka, we discussed that Ukrainians made a lot of attempts to capture. The Russians managed to restore their lost position. The Ukrainians were forced to step back, and now I'm talking about the 5th Assault Brigade, 22nd Mechanized, 18th Assault Brigade, 3rd Assault Brigade. So all their attempts were repelled. After the Ukrainians made a few attempts to attack the Russians from the south using the force of 24th Mechanized and 28th Mechanized Brigades, those attempts also were repelled by the Russians. And after the failed attempts on the south, the Ukrainians took a decision to relaunch their attacks, their attempts on the north. And for example, some Russian mappers have already updated their map, showing that, for example, Ukrainians managed to enter Berkhovka and to establish control over at least this part of that settlement. Today the Russians published a video of counterattack, and according to that video, very fresh video, the Russians managed to return control over entire Berkhovka and to push the Ukrainians from that settlement. But this is not the most important. Today also the Ukrainians launched their attack from Grigorovka in direction of Dubovo-Vasilievka on this area, and there was a video of that, but it wasn't like a real offensive operation as we just saw in the vicinity of Avdiivka. It just was just one platoon under support of one personal armored carrier tried to enter the forest, tried to push the Russians back, But anyway, I believe that that was recon combat. We haven't received any numbers, any updates about the results of that attack. But anyway, we understand that recently, at least a few days ago, the Russians were the side who were attacking in this area, trying to cut the supply between Grigorovka and Bogdanovka. So basically the Ukrainians tried to improve their positions and to secure their flanks before the next step, before the next phase of offensive operation in the square between Berkhovka, Yagidne and the settlement by the name of Khromovo in this area. So they need to secure the flank, because if the Ukrainians are able to dig deeper in this small salient, of course, if the Russians attack from this flank, the entire Ukraine army can get into a small cauldron. So for these purposes, they need to secure the flank, and after that, they're able to proceed and to continue. Now we are moving to Seversk bridgehead, to this area. There were no updates, just the morning video that we discussed. The Ukrainians launched few attacks in direction of Yagidne, and that was like attack of the same level as attack of the Russians in Avdiivka. As we discussed in the previous video, the Ukrainians just basically want to repeat the Russian, let's say like success story to attack Solidar, but before taking Solidar, they need to take Yagidne, the settlement. As you can see, there was a very attack. For now, we still also haven't received any updates about the results of that attack. There was a very big video. This video was made by the 54th Mechanized Brigade. That attack was made not by the force of 10 Mountain Assault Brigade, but that video was made by the force of 54th Mechanized Brigade. So basically the 54th Brigade is the main forces that was involved in that attack. We don't know about the results, but anyway, we're going to maintain the BAP, and at least this area will be colored into gray zone, or at least under Ukraine control, if you can't get another information. So basically, when talking about the Ukrainians currently on this bridgehead, they're trying to develop their attack in Yagidne to maintain the gray zone and to get as close as possible to this defense belt. And also the Ukrainians attack the Russians along the railroad ways, and they're trying to move in direction of Bilogorovka. So they want just to establish control. As we understand, according to these arrows, as we see, the first thing the Ukrainians want to do is to return control over this bridgehead, to cut the supply road between the Russian forces in Lysychansk and the Russian forces in Artyomovsk. And after that, they will be able to continue further. And the next step, even according to the Wagner, the Prigozhin, who told us that after taking these positions, the Ukrainians will try to establish and to cut the supply road between Artyomovsk and Popasna. So this is the main purpose of the Ukrainians, to encircle this settlement from the north. This is the operation to encircle the Russians from the south. So as you can see, everything, for now, everything is according to Prigozhin plan. But Prigozhin published this plan a few months ago, so I believe that the Russian generals have already analyzed the plan and probably found a solution how to reduce the effects of the Ukrainian offensive operation in this area. Interesting video we got from Bilogorovka. I can't tell you for sure when this video is fresh. We see the green grass in this area and so on, but I can't tell you when exactly these armored vehicles were destroyed. The Ukrainians claims that this video is geolocated, and this video we see, let's say, the cemetery of destroyed Russian armored vehicles. As you can see, significant number of tanks, personal armored carriers that probably were destroyed not even this summer, but maybe all these tanks, armored carriers were destroyed during the Russian offensive. Not just Russians, probably these tanks also belonged to the Ukrainians. All these armored vehicles were destroyed also maybe during the Russian counter-offensive operation that took place after the fall of Lysychansk agglomeration. A lot of armored vehicles, most of them are burned, they're very old, so maybe this video is fresh, but this video shows us the cemetery of armored vehicles, and most of them were destroyed maybe the last year in August or September during the Battle of Lysychansk. But anyway, very interesting, another cemetery of armored vehicles, at least in the Bilogorovka area. As you can see just on this video, we see at least 3 tanks. These 3 tanks, then we can see a personal armored carrier, or maybe another tank. Now it's another tank. Then we see another tank, so 5 tanks in a row. This is like armored carriers, I understand. more or less available for another exploitation, and another personal carrier that was destroyed and completely is not appropriate for the next usage. And now we're moving to Liman frontline, and today, for example, the Russian blogger Ryba reported that, as you can see, this very like a lot of there's red color and light red color showing the Russian progress, and based on Ryba report, the Russians, as a result of fierce fightings and significant storming operation in this area during the previous weeks, managed to establish control at least over this territory. So according to Ryba, this area is under complete Russian control. For now, neither of the mappers have updated their map showing this progress. Just Ryba is the only blogger who reported us about this progress. So for now, I'm not going to update this map as well. We need more geolocations. We need this confirmation from other sources. We will discuss this during the video, but for now, this area still, we will show this area as at least under Ukrainian control, or maybe we will color this in, we will remove any color showing that this area maybe is in the gray zone. The only thing that confirms some progress of the Russians, at least on the northern flank on this area, is that Ukrainians published the video. We discussed this video in the morning. For now, this I believe we will try to show this video the next time. For some reason, this video hasn't uploaded. There was another video how the Ukrainians managed to capture the Russian TOS flamethrower system, and the Ukrainians published the video with better quality, how they were bombing. The Ukrainians were bombing and attacking Russian positions in this area using the flamethrower system that were captured by the Ukrainians during the previous battles. So basically, at least that video confirms that maybe the Russians during the previous attacks managed to establish control over at least this part of the bridgehead because of those attacks with the flamethrower systems. But there were no any geolocated videos from, at least from this area, at least from the central or from the western, or and I'm not talking about the southwestern part of the square that this bridgehead was taken by the Russians. For now, there are no updates, such updates geolocated I'm talking about. The Ministry of Defense reported as a result of fierce fightings on the Liman front line, the Ukrainians lost 80 soldiers and 5 armored vehicles. The level of losses had a little bit increased in comparison with the previous day, but it's still less in comparison with the 7th of July when the Ukrainians lost 95 soldiers on the same bridgehead. Now we're moving to the Kupiansk, and one more thing, that this is the area, according to a lot of updates, a lot of confirmations, is the area where the Russians launched their own counterattack, but nevertheless, the attacks, the Russians still say that Ukrainians have accumulated, and anyway, the Ukrainians will launch a counterattack. So maybe this is not a real attack, but as the same situation as we saw from the Ukrainian side on Avdiivka front line, when the Ukrainians were trying to maintain the gray zone before the Russian attack. So maybe the Russians are doing the same. They're trying to maintain the gray zone, to capture the checkpoints, to get as close as possible to the Ukrainian positions, just to have their eyes on there and to be ready to meet the Ukrainians during their greatest counterattack. And now we're moving to the Kupiansk front line, and the same blogger Ryba also reported about the Russian progress in the vicinity of Velika Novoselovka. As you can see, according to his report, the Russians during the previous days, as we discussed, managed to capture the railroad ways and few streets in Velika Novoselovka, but after that the Russians took a decision to stop, and they focused on the southern area, trying to maintain the gray zone between Stelmakhovka and Krivosheivka, between Kalamychuha and Stelmakhovka, and basically the Russians were focused on capturing of this forest line. This is the gray zone. This is not the area that was under Ukrainian control, so that the Russians managed to push the Ukrainians back. No, that was the gray zone, and also few options. Either the Ukrainians are going to counterattack, the Russians are trying to maintain the gray zone and to get as close as possible, to be ready, and to give some time for forces in Krivosheivka, Kuzyomovka, Storozhevka to get ready before massive attack of the Ukrainians. Or maybe the Russians are planning to continue advancing in direction of Stelmakhovka and Berestova. We'll see. But the results of the Ukrainian counterattack on the south tells me more and more that maybe the Russians will make an attempt to penetrate this defense belt and to get as far as close as possible to Oskol. But don't forget that the Ukrainians have also mined this territory with mines, have created a lot of trenches and mines, minefields. So this is not an easy job for the Russians. So maybe I don't know what the Russians are going to do. Anyway, sooner or later we're going to see. And the Russians also published another video from Kupiansk frontline, how they managed to discover and to destroy the Ukrainian Raider ANTPQ-50. This light vehicle arrived to some interception of road, and then the Ukrainians established the Raider that the Russians managed to discover and to destroy using Krasnopol shell. As a result of fierce fightings on the Kupiansk front line, the Ukrainians lost 20 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system. As you can see, the level of losses is minimal in comparison with the previous days. And the final bridgehead is Kherson. There were no more updates about about another landing operations or something like this. The only thing that always surprised me when talking about Kherson frontline, when talking about the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, is the level of losses. The Russians, again, they reported that Ukrainians lost 60 units, 60 soldiers on this bridgehead and 9 armored vehicles, including 1 tank. The question is where exactly the Ukrainians could lose such a big number of forces. It's very difficult to understand. When there was clashes for Antonov Bridge, we can understand that maybe the losses came from this area, who knows. Today, for example, the Russians reported that as a result, the Wotsa, by the way, the Russians report that the Wotsa left this territory completely, that entered this territory after the flooding, after the destroying of Kakhovka Dam. And the Russians reported that during the previous days, and including today, they managed to restore control over every single island on the Dnipro river, so these islands. So basically, according to some Russian sources, the Russians during these days managed to return control over this part of islands. So maybe the losses that the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation provided us took place exactly among these islands as a result of fierce battles and clashes with the Ukrainians marine infantries in the same area. Maybe the losses are coming from here. But one more time, we haven't received any video or any confirmation from this bridgehead about any clashes, about any active fightings in this area. And to tell the truth, if you ask my opinion, I would like to see some epic battles between Ukrainians and the Russians on the boats somewhere here, because I believe it would be very interesting to analyze and to understand the tactics that both sides use, at least particularly on this bridgehead. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.